Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another deck profile. Today is going to be a Legend World Fairy Wiser Sarkal deck, or as I like to call it, Fairy Sarkal. So Fairies have always been a deck, and as of late they've been getting a little bit of new support here and there, and I feel like now they have enough power to at least compete with some of the more recent decks. Our buddy is going to be the Dainty Wind Sylph. When this card enters the field, drop the top 3 cards of your deck and put any number of Weiterstadt and Fairy cards among them into your gauge, and you gain 1 life for each card put there. Then, at the start of your attack phase, if you have a total of 3 different Weiterstadt or Fairies on your field, this card and all cards on your field get plus 3,000 power, plus 1 crit, and penetrate. Basically, this card just helps charge our gauge, it helps mill us some cards, and it gives everyone a field buff. So the idea is this is going to be a size 1 rush deck, primarily. So there's an option for like a size 3 build, but this version of Sylph just helps us increase our damage output and give us penetrate. We run 4 of the buddy. Then we run probably one of the more powerful Sylphs, Wind Frolicker Sylph. So its call cost is pay 2 gauge. What's good is it's a size 0, so if you're running the size 3 build, it fits perfectly into the field formation. And this card gets plus 1 crit for each different Fairy and Weiterstadt in your drop zone. If you just have a whole bunch of different Fairies and Weiterstadt in your drop zone, this card will get a whole bunch of crit, and then with Dainty Wind, it will get an additional crit if you have a full board set up, and it'll even get penetrate. So this thing can hit for a lot of damage. Next, we run 3 copies of Great Wind Fairy Sylph. You pay 1 gauge, pay 1 life. When it enters, you could choose one of the following abilities. You could either equip an item from your drop zone by paying its equip cost, or call a Weiterstadt monster from your drop zone by paying its call cost. So this is just a good Grave Res card for either an item or a monster, and because we're going to be doing a little bit of self-milling, we'll definitely have the options to do that. Next, we run 2 of the original Sylph, Wind Fairy Sylph. So you could pay a gauge, and when this card enters the field, you choose an item from your drop zone and put it into your hand. It's kind of like Great Wind Fairy Sylph, but a little bit worse. But what's more important is it's a Weiterstadt. That's the more important thing, and it's a size 0, so it also fits into size 3 builds. Next, we run 2 copies of Sylph Fairies Banquet. So this is the Impact Monster Sylph. You pay 2 gauge and put a Weiterstadt or Fairy monster from your field to the drop zone, and then when this card enters during your final phase, stand all Fairy and Weiterstadt monsters. All Fairy and Weiterstadt monsters on your field can attack during the final phase. This card's really good because a lot of cards just either end the attack phase or just a whole bunch of rest cards. This is a really good card to get around a lot of that, and it's also a Fairy and a Weiterstadt. Next, we run 2 copies of Giant Bird Thunderbolt. When this card enters the field by a card effect, put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge, and when this card attacks, if you have a total of 3 or more Weiterstadt or Thunder Emperor cards on your field, draw a card. So this card's really good because we could call it through Great Wind Fairy Sylph and another card, and then if we do, we just get 2 gauge for borderline free, and then when it attacks, most of the time you're going to have a full formation anyway, it can draw a card. Next, we run 3 copies of Red-eyed Succubus. So it has an act ability, Demonic Eyes of Temptation. You may discard a Weiterstadt card from your hand and pay 1 gauge. If you do, draw 2 cards. You can only use it once per turn. So it's really good at getting Weiterstadt cards into our graveyard, and then it's replacing the card we discarded and itself from playing it by drawing us 2 more cards. Next, we run 3 copies of Treasure Jailer. So he's going to be the one part of the mill engine of the deck. When he enters the field, you could put the top 3 cards of your deck into your drop zone and you take a damage. Then he has an act ability, Landslide. If this card is in your drop zone, you could pay a gauge and if you do, call it from your drop zone. He's just mostly there because he's a Weiterstadt and he mills us 3. Next, we run 3 Malicious Elizabeth. So she has an act ability, Absolute Ruler of the Queen. You put 1 Weiterstadt monster from your field to the drop zone. If you do, choose a size 1 or less Weiterstadt monster from your drop zone and put it onto the field by paying its call cost, and then you can only use it once per turn. She's what I think makes the size 1 builds a little bit better, because she combos with Thunderbolt, and on top of Great Wind Fairy Sylph comboing with Thunderbolt, but she also just can grab almost anything that's a size 1 or less Weiterstadt. And in the size 3 builds, you can't really run that. Next, we run 4 copies of Loyal Unicorn. So when this card enters, if you have another Weiterstadt or fairy monster on your field, you may discard a card from your hand. If you do, draw a card. It's essentially looting. We just discard a monster and it adds to the different count of fairies and Weiterstadt in our graveyard for our different Sylph abilities, and it draws us a card, so it helps us thin out our deck. That's it for the monsters. Next, we have the spells. So we run 4 copies of Folklore of Weiterstadt. You pay a gauge, pay 1 life, choose 2 size 2 or less Weiterstadt monsters from your drop zone, and call them into separate areas by paying their call cost. You can only use this once per turn. It's just another grave res, so we're going to be doing a lot of discarding and some self-milling, and then we're going to call them from our drop or our hand. It's just a really solid card. Next, we run 4 copies of this great spell. So you can only cast this card at the end of the first battle during your opponent's turn. And then you just pay 2 gauge, pay 2 life, and then you end their attack phase. So it's a really solid defense spell. Next, we run 3 copies of Yngl Gard. Its call cost is dropping a hand card, and then you draw 2 cards. It helps us get more cards into our drop, and then we draw more cards and it replaces itself. So it's a pretty solid card. Next, we run 2 copies of Annoying Ways of the Troll. So you can only cast this card during your opponent's turn when he or she calls a size 3 monster or casts a spell, and then we pay 2 gauge, and then if there are 2 or more Weiterstadt on our field, we can nullify the spell or nullify the call. Next, we run 2 copies of Breathen Gard. We pay 2 gauge and we either nullify the spell an opponent is trying to cast or destroy a spell on the field. That's all we really are going to use it for. We don't have Berserk Guard to combo with it. Next, we run 4 copies of their new item, Demon Encyclopedia. This card is actually kind of bonkers for Weiterstadt. So if you have a Weiterstadt monster on your field, all Weiterstadt cards on your field can't be destroyed, returned to hand. Their abilities can't be nullified by your opponent's card effects, so it just helps shut down the options that the opponent has to interact with your board. And then at the start of the attack phase, if there are 3 or more Weiterstadt cards on your field, you draw 2 cards for this turn. They all get plus 10,000 power, plus 10,000 defense, and double attack. If you combine that with Dainty Wind Sylph, they'll get plus 13,000 power, plus 10,000 defense, an additional crit, penetrate, and double attack with the book. The whole idea is to self-mill, play a whole bunch of fairies, especially one of them being Wind Frolicker, and then just basically swing for massive damage with penetrate and double strike. That's it for the main board. I have some other options of some other cards you could possibly run. In the size 3 variant, you'd probably run Chaos Sylph. So its call cost is put any number of monsters from your field into its soul and pay 2 gauge. Then it has a counter. So call this card from your hand by paying its call cost. If 10 or more cards are in your drop zone, this card gets plus 15,000 power, plus 15,000 defense, plus 2 crit, and then it has triple attack and soul guard naturally. So it's a really beefy card. It doesn't necessarily play a whole lot with Demon Encyclopedia and some of the other size 1's more specific support cards, but it's still a very good card in its own right, and it has its own kind of sub-build of this deck because its ability just is so strong. Then you could also run Chaos Elberon. So it has an ability, Dragon Ash. When this card is put from the field to the drop zone, put the top 2 cards of your deck into the drop zone and draw a card. This is like the size 3 variant's mill engine because it can't necessarily run some of the size 1 cards because it wants to just have a size 3 and then 2 size 0s to meet the formation requirement. But it's definitely a good card nonetheless to run in some of the other builds, and it's a card to think about. You could also run Spring Breeze Barrier Sylph. So this is just another Fairy Weiterstadt. Its ability isn't too bad, which is during the attack phase, you may discard a card from your hand. If you do, all monsters on your field get +1 crit, and you may use this ability once per turn. When this card is discarded from your hand, for this turn, a monster on your field gets Penetrate. So the Penetrate part doesn't really matter because you're going to want to like have your buddy out to give them all Penetrate anyway, but it's the fact that you could just discard a card to give something +1 crit is what really matters. You could also run Undying Wise King Count Dawn. He's a Weiterstadt. He has the Omnilord ability, but since you're in Legend World, you could run multiple copies if you want. But this one's really good because at the beginning of each player's attack phase, if this card is in your drop zone, you could pay 1 life and call it, so that way he can help keep the 3 monster formation out. And then when another monster on your field would be destroyed by your opponent's cards, you could put this card from your field to the drop zone and keep that card alive. He's just a pretty solid Weiterstadt card. Another card you could run is Count Dawn of the Distant Days. He's just another Weiterstadt, and his effect's pretty simple with it being Omnilord, and at the end of the battle with this card, you may return it to your hand. So the idea is just play him, meet this full board requirements, bounce him back, and then you could discard him or you could replay him the next turn. So he's not terrible. You could run Valkyrie of the All-Knowing. This isn't a Weiterstadt card, but it's just a really good discard fodder, and it can interact with great spells. So there's a couple of great spells that you could also run, but most of the time you're just going to be using it for the discard fodder, and when it's discarded, you charge and draw. You could run Gard. So Gard, it's mostly there for nullifying penetrates. So if they're going to attack one of your monsters and their monster has Penetrate, you could just destroy the target. The attack is lost, and you get the benefit of charging 1 and drawing 1. So if you want another defense spell, you could run Elude's Ring. It's just a simple nullify the attack if you're being attacked, and then you could also discard a card from your hand, draw a card, and gain 1 life. So it's just a solid defense spell. In the size 1 variant, you could run a Wise Move. Pay 2 gauge, pay 1 life, and then basically you just call a size 1 from your drop by paying its call cost. You could run the Pantheon. This is a simple set spell where all size 2 monsters on your field can't be destroyed by card effects. The Encyclopedia kind of already does this, but it's still pretty decent in case you don't have the Encyclopedia. But on top of that, it has the counter ability during your opponent's turn. Choose a monster or item on the opponent's field. You may drop a hand card. If you do, rest that card. So it could be used also as like another defense spell, and you discard cards, so that sometimes can matter with some of the discard synergies that the deck could possibly have. It's just overall a solid card. You could also run Darkness Rune. So its call cost is paying 1 life, and then you get to choose one of the following 3 abilities. You could either put 2 cards from your deck into your gauge, which is pretty solid. You could drop a soul from a monster on the field, which can be pretty good, depends on the matchup, or you could destroy a size 1 or less monster on your opponent's field. That's probably the worst of the abilities. Most of the time you're just going to be using it to charge 2, but sometimes dropping the soul can matter. Then you could always run Loyalty. It's just a solid defense spell with its slew of different abilities. Most of the time you just use it as counterattack to stop the opponent from calling past their 3rd monster. And then there's also Buddy Block, another solid defense spell, which most of the time you're going to be using it to stop the damage if they've attacked 4 or more times. And then, if you really want, there's the Great Spell Package. I'm not too keen on the Great Spell Package personally, but some people really enjoy the Great Spell Package. So you could run Final Battleground. So it's a set spell. When you cast a card with Great Spell in its name, you draw 2 cards. and put this card into the drop zone. So this is just a draw 2 if you cast a great spell. We're running one great spell in the deck already, but like if you're running the great spell package, you're running more. Most of the time this is just going to be a slightly delayed draw 2, and then you can only have one of the final battleground on your field. Then you could also run Mission of Great Judgment, Great Spell Apocalypse. Its cast cost is put the top 3 cards of your deck into its soul face down. Then this card can't be destroyed by card effects by your opponent. When a monster on your field is destroyed, put a card from its soul to the drop zone. It's a slower self-mill. And then when the cards in the soul become 0, you draw a card. Then you could run Great Spell Bifrost of Heaven and Earth. You could choose one of the following 2. You could either put an Asgard or dungeon enemy monster from your drop zone to your hand and gain 1 life. Most of the time you're not going to do that. Like if you're running the Great Spell package, you're probably going to run the Valkyrie of All-Knowing, which means you actually do have a target for it. But most of the time you're just going to use its second ability if you're running the Great Spell package, which is draw a card and put all souls from a spell with set to the drop zone. So it combos with Mission, it combos with the other great spell, which I'll get to in a second, and then it just draws you a card. Like at worst, it just draws you a card. And then lastly, you could run Great Spell City of Devastation. What this card does is when you set it, you could basically search for Mission Card Judgment, Great Spell Apocalypse, and then you could drop all cards from the Mission Great Spell Apocalypse, and when you do, you gain 3 life. So it's just a way of gaining some life, on top of which when all of the souls of Apocalypse is dropped, you get to draw a card. It's just a really weird way of like deck thinning and self-milling and then drawing a card and gaining a life. I'm personally not a huge fan of it, but if you want to run it, it's just another option. So yeah, that is my deck for Fairies Sarkal, and it's definitely an interesting deck. I do enjoy like wide board, high crit decks. That's just my personal play style. It's actually pretty decent considering you could run 2 really good cancels in the game in this deck, and it could help with certain matchups for sure. So I hope you all enjoyed. Think about liking and subscribing for regular Buddyfight content, and I will see you in the next video.